Mr. President, it is through your influence that the Nigerian National Assembly has become a haven for legislative rascality. Mr. President, it's under your watch that the National Assembly has become an extension of the executive, grossly violating the principles of separation of powers and rubber stamping the whims and caprices of your office, all while singing the international anthem of psychoviolence. On your mandate we shall stand. Mr. President, thanks to your political machinations, Nigeria is now bedeviled by a captured National Assembly, the most ineffective in its checks and balances role since the start of the Fourth Republic.
You've come this far, you beat the front security, and you beat the second one. How far more can you go on this? How far more can you go on this?
In simple terms, it's not about beating the first and second gates and barricade. It's about me and a duly elected senator walking into the chambers to resume my constituted duties as I was elected and mandated by the good people of Kogi Central and INEC. And it's unfortunate that we got in today, which is the 22nd of July 2025, having duly notified the Senate through 2 letters that I would be resuming functions today. As a matter of fact, I'm disappointed on 2 grounds. One is the number of armed policemen that we met outside, all well kitted with guns, charged at a female senator who is unarmed with her people here, patriotic Nigerians. And the second thing is the fact that the Senate, under the leadership of Akpabio, have decided to become lawbreakers and by denying me entrance into the chambers to resume my duty. There's been some conversations in the media by his own team, trying to twist the narrative that the judge did not order my reinstatement, and I'd like to clarify that. You see, pursuant to Section 318 of the 1999 Constitution, it is very clear that decisions of a court comes in 5 ways. It could be a judicial decree, it could be a sentence, it could be an order, it could be a conviction, and it could be a recommendation. So an order is just one of the 5 decisions that a judge can pronounce over any case, and mine tilt towards a recommendation. Now you would think that a recommendation is a voluntary, that means the Senate has either they comply or they have the right not to comply, but I'd like to clarify that. Again, if you go further to the to section 287 subsection 3 of the 1999 Constitution, again it actually specifies in clear terms that decisions, that's any of these 5 decisions of any of the possible on every authority. So what that means in simple terms, whether they mention that the Justice Binta Nyako of the Federal High Court made an order or made a sentence or made a judicial decree or a recommendation, whatever, however they want to interpret the literal words, interpretation of the words, it is still a decision of a court and it is still binding on the National Assembly.
You can really understand the position of Natasha and the choice of words used by Pastor Tunde Bakare, describing the National Assembly, the 10th National Assembly, as judicial rascality. Natasha, as a senator representing Kogi Central, being voted and elected, duly elected by the people, has the right to represent her constituency, which voted her for legislative representation. Now, recall in March 2024, there was a drama, a controversial circumstances leading to his kangaroo suspension because she forced out over the intimidations or alleged sexual assault meted on her by the Senate of the 10th National Assembly, Senator Akpabio. It is quite unfortunate, rather than the senators having a review and setting up judicial inquest over these weighty allegations, decided, of course, to witch hunt Natasha, Senator Akpabio Natasha. It is quite very disturbing, and such development has degenerated to the point that a duly elected senator has to be suspended for 6 months. Now, a development which eventually was reviewed by Justice Nyako in June, citing that the Senate has no powers. They overreach their powers. It is an abuse of power. They don't have such powers under the law, describing it as excessive, unconstitutional undertaking backed by the senators, where it is expected that the Senate will sit for 188 days in a year, and you are suspending a senator for more than 180 days. Franchising the constituency of the right of representation. On what basis should Natasha be suspended? It says such action is excessive and unconstitutional. They went overboard. The reason why Tunde Bakare in his statement said that under the watch of Ahmed Bola Tinubu, the National Assembly has become rubber stamps, operating in such level of impunity and rascality. They are now assumed or presumed to be above the law, having no recourse or regard to any law. They are the law themselves. They are the breakers of the law. The law is meant to be broken with them. It is not binding on their personality. It is not binding on their integrity, and of course, so that's judicial rascality and become a rubber stamp, and the rest of them was more pronounced under the watch of Ahmed Bola Tinubu. The National Assembly that was once hallowed has become a mockery. The Committee of Nations before Nigerians, it is no longer valued. You can imagine the drama playing out, that the people, Natasha went with her supporters to resume her duty, and eventually everywhere was militarized. The National Assembly complex unfolded with dramas. You see military men armed as if they are going for combat. They are going after a terrorist or whatever. These are the same people who will complain that the terrorists have destroyed their camp, invaded their camps, and the rest of them, get them massacred and the rest of them, but they are situated at the entrance of the National Assembly to enforce the biddings of those who are above the law. Those who felt nobody could talk to them, nobody can question their actions. They are not answerable or, of course, accountable to anyone. They have the state, it's more or less described as a step capture. In the words of Tunde Bakare, it is nothing short of this: judicial rascality and embodiment of rascality, and that is quite unfortunate. Why must Natasha be barred from resuming her legislative duty to the Kogi Central constituency, where she hails from, that have given her the powers of representation under the law. She was a duly elected, have the same privileges and rights as any other senator there. They are coming from a constituencies, so they are in no way more privileged than Natasha. Natasha is representing an entity, a constituency. Likewise, God's will Akpabio, irrespective of the fact he was elected as the Senate president by the senators. So he is not for administrative convenience and the rest of them. But the legislative duty is the business of every senator. Why should Natasha be treated in such a bully manner? Even despite the court's injunction, the courts ruled that the Senate and the Senate president overreached their powers. They acted in contradiction with the provisions of the law. They acted as an arbiter in their own case, rather than reviewing the weighty allegation bordering on misconduct and abuse of office by the State Senate Assembly has been alleged by Senator Natasha. What they did was the other way around. They begin hunting Natasha with all flexing power and the rest of them to intimidate and silence her. That is not how a system should be viewed. We are more or less in a system of cabals, a system that have hijacked the states, where people, you can imagine, with the influence and exposure of Natasha, she could be silenced by her colleagues for vested interests, so people could no longer express themselves, not even the ordinary Nigerians. This is a senator representing Kogi Central as part of a constituency, and she was silenced to the point that they don't want her within the premises of the Senate complex, where the Senate complex was the Senate complex built by the father's money, or has it become their personal property, an enterprise that they have the power to hire and to sack? They could lay off whoever they want to lay off at any time. It doesn't matter. They could shut the door against them, even what it does, regardless of whatever the law says. They are the law themselves. They are above the law. They can pay off the lawyers and buy them off, with the common resources of the people. And everyone is watching because it has to do with Natasha. Majority of Nigerians are silent, watching as the drama keep unfolding. The same way Buhari described the Igbos, that they just gave him 5%, and everybody was happy, rejoicing that of course it's all about the Igbos. But by the time it is done on everyone, you now understand that over 98% of Nigerians were definitely sidelined. Everybody began to complain. They thought that it would majorly affect the Igbos, but it turned out the other way. That it was eventually become the less affected under Tinubu Buhari's regime. Now everybody is quiet. Natasha is being prosecuted, unjustly persecuted by this crop of irrelevant senators. I call it irrelevant because if they are relevant with the laws, they are conversant with the conventional laws of the Constitution of Nigeria, they will understand that they are overstretching their powers, as they have been even reminded by Justice Binta Nyako. Look at what Justice Binta Nyako has to say regarding this development. It is very interesting development indeed, honestly. Very interesting one as a matter of reality. In June, Justice Binta Nyako of the Federal High Court in Abuja ruled that the Senate overreached its powers. That the Senate overreached its powers, which means the powers of the Senate to suspend their fellow colleagues have limitations. It is not an absolute power. They have their limitations, their rights and obligations to each other. Now, she described the suspension as excessive and unconstitutional. Once that is unconstitutional, now is a breach of the Constitution, is a breach of the law. It is a threatening offense. The third Senate Assembly and the President, Akpabio, committed a treason against the Nigerian state. The senators has committed a treason offense against the Nigerian state and the Nigerian people, and it is punishable under the law. It is unconstitutional. So you are going contrary to the position of the state that gives you the privilege to assume whatever positions you are today. Do you understand that? But does it matter to these people? Because they are highly wired, just as Pastor Tunde Bakare said, that all these things were engineered by the personality and antecedents of Ahmed Bola Tinubu. The judicial rascality was allowed, was thriving because of his actions and his body language. How could the senators act in such derogatory and abusive manner, even disregarding the court's injunctions regarding their actions? Now, she described this suspension as excessive and unconstitutional, pointing out that the National Assembly is mandated to sit for 181 days annually. You can imagine. And suspending a lawmaker for nearly the entire section violate the right of the constituents. Suspending the lawmaker for the entire section of the year is the height of rascality. It's unconstitutional. It means the people could not be represented in the legislative process, seizing her rights and privileges, her allowances and the rest of them, despite the judgments. Now, that is where my interest lies. So, despite the judgment, Senate leadership insisted she remains suspended pending receipt of the certified true copy of the ruling. This is the pronouncement of the judgment of the court of law. Insisted that she remains suspended until the certified true copy of the ruling. This is a country where we found ourselves. This is a country where there is no regard for the law or the judiciary, where even the legislative chambers are found breaking laws, taking laws into their hands, overreaching its rights and boundaries. It doesn't matter, they could trample upon whosoever they want to trample, they can violate whatever and believe they could get away with that and Nigerians are watching, keenly, closely observing that. Not that Nigerians are happy with the developments, but definitely they feel they control the resources, the security apparatus of the state, and the money to share and to do whatever and get away with that. But how long will that continue? Remain the most critical question at this particular time. Everything has its cycle. How long will this cycle, vicious cycle, oppressive, repressive cycle continue? If the Senate, if a senator like Natasha could be denied her right of representation, then who else? Is it an ordinary citizen? Of course, which even the Senate President have said, like, can we allow the poor to breathe, describing her fellow citizens as poor Nigerians? What was his background before he became the governor of Cross River State? That is quite very unfortunate. Now, let's continue briefly. Natasha has vowed to resume yesterday, prompting a Sunday warning from Senate spokesperson Yemi, whatever he called himself, who maintained that no binding order required her reinstatement. No binding order required her reinstatement. You can imagine interpreting the outcome, the position, the decision of the court. What else do they want to hear that have not been said? Justice Peter Nyako has made it very clear. You overstepped your boundary. You outreached your boundaries, describing it as excessive, unconstitutional. Once it is unconstitutional, what do? What other interpretation do you expect? Because it's a gross violation. Anything that is unconstitutional, you are meant to be guided and bounded within the provisions of the Constitution. Now, when something is described unconstitutional, it's an act of treason. Now, you are now indulged in the act of treason, and yet you are expecting more explanation. That is the ruling of the court is not binding on you. Does not suggest that you should instate your colleagues. He added that the court merely offers an advisory, not a directive, and claimed Natasha was yet to comply with orders to pay 5 million fine for contempt and publish apology in the national dailies and on Facebook. You can imagine, to pay a fine for being assertive, explaining her own self and her own ordeal, the suffering, the intimidation, this alleged sexual harassment she has been subjected to by the said Senate President. There was no judicial inquiry set up, and Natasha was not given opportunity to defend and present her evidences. So they have to shut her up and believe they could take any arbitrary decisions without any recourse to the provisions of the Constitution, and then lording it over, believing that they could, they have all the powers to intimidate and bring everyone under subjection, and nothing happens. They can get away with that. Of course, nobody speaks. They're in charge of Abuja, they control the resources, and that is just the case. And they are in parley with the sitting president, which Tunde Bakare have described that was the worst Senate plenary or section ever in the history of Nigeria. Let's have your own take regarding this development and the way forward. Definitely, Natasha, according to the provision of the ruling of the court, must resume her representations regardless of whatever opinion or shared sentiment among the senators. Let's have your own take regarding this development and what does that portend for Nigeria, because everyone is living in fear and uncertainty. Not even the Senate members are left in this oppression and suppression. Thanks for watching.